Welcome back. It's been 60 years since the March on Washington and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech. August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington, including civil rights activist and Sumter native James Felder, who is still with us here on Awareness today. Thank you so much for sharing your story. This is so important. Take us back 60 years ago. Before the break, you talked about how you were a student at Clark Atlanta University. You graduated, then you were drafted into the military, and that's how you ended up in Washington. So what was your role in the March on Washington on August 28, 1963?
As long as I was in college, I got the deferments, and so the day I graduated, here comes this draft notice. I had to report to Fort Jackson. I didn't want to go in the Army. I wanted to go in the Air Force. Shaw Air Force Base in Sumter.
Right.
I grew up there. My first flight as a Boy Scout was from Shaw Air Force Base to Greenville, so I wanted to go Air Force. But the Army said, we got to satisfy our quota. We need you in the Army. So I got drafted. Spent 6 months at Fort Jackson. Basic training, AIT training, leadership school. Then one day they selected 10 of us out of 1,000 to go up to Washington to try out for the Army Honor Guard unit, which is based at Fort Myer, Virginia, where Arlington Cemetery is. So I went up, made the cut, and in an 18-month period, I buried 1,100 people in Arlington National Cemetery.
Wow.
So on the 28th of August, the March on Washington, 1963, I am dressed in full Army gear, bayonet, fixed bayonet, live ammunition, gas mask, sitting on the Potomac River overlooking the Lincoln Memorial where the march was. The Kennedys didn't know what to expect. They thought it would be riots, so they had all of the military forces in the Washington area on high alert. So here I'm sitting on the banks of the river, couldn't see it because we were behind it, but we could hear all the speakers.
Give us some more context as to why President Kennedy didn't know what to expect, because I thought that he was for change and was for helping black people.
He was, but this march was a different thing. When they realized that all of the civil rights group had come together, NAACP, Urban League, SNCC, SCLC, they didn't know what to expect. You talking about inviting 100,000, 200,000 people to Washington, D.C., they feared there might have been riots.
And this was the first time anything like that ever happened.
First time it had happened like that.
Yeah.
Now, it had happened in the 40s. There was a march on Washington headed by A. Philip Randolph. He was a railroad sleeping car porter chairman. But it wasn't to that magnitude, so they didn't know what to expect. So everything shut down. Government, and the only people who were allowed to go to their offices were military folks. So here we are, ready to quell a riot if it happened. 250,000 people come. By the end of the day, 7 o'clock, they had all left. Nobody was arrested. There was no mayhem, no rioting. So it went down in history as the greatest march up to that point.
Mr. Felder, as you were sitting there dressed in all your tactical gear, what did you think before the march actually happened? Did you think that something bad may have come out of this?
I didn't, because we had been trained even before into the Army in non-violence by Dr. King and others. So but we were at the same time prepared for the worst. So I'm sitting on the banks of the river. I'd rather have been on the other side with the marchers, but the Army says, no, you stay where you are.
Yeah.
Listen to Dr. King. Just before he got up to speak, Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP at that time, went up to him and said, the old man just died. The old man was W.E.B. Du Bois. He died on the day of the March on Washington in 1963. Yeah. He was living in Africa at that point in Ghana. Yeah.
Wow.
So we heard all of that. We heard the speeches. Now, John Lewis was the student participant. They sanitized his remarks. They said, now you can't be too rude. And he had the last part of his remarks were, we're going to go back home to Georgia, we're going to get people registered to vote, and we're going to march through Georgia like Sherman. They said, no, take that Sherman part out.
Yeah.
We don't want to refer to the Civil War.
Yeah.
But other than that, it went well. Everything went very well that day.
In that moment, listening to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech that is still, to this day, one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic speech in U.S. history. What was it like for you hearing those words?
That energized me, and it also just said to me I needed to go back to the South when I got out of the Army and do something to increase participation by my people in the political process. That's what it did to me. So got out the Army, went to Howard Law School, and then came back to South Carolina. A guy named Vernon Jordan brought me back. You know, had known Vernon in Atlanta. He was an Atlanta boy, and he had been selected to carry out the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in terms of registering black folk all over the South. So he needed somebody for South Carolina. He came to Columbia, he talked to Ida Quincy Newman, he talked to Miss Simpkins, Lincoln Jenkins, Matthew Perry, and they all pointed to me. They said, there's this guy up there in Washington about to graduate, so you go get him and bring him back home. And that's how I ended up coming back home. And Jordan snatched me back to South Carolina.
And you came back home after such a pivotal time, being involved in so much. Besides the March on Washington, you also, unfortunately, had a first-hand look at President Kennedy's death.
Well, I rushed home. Telephone was ringing when I got to my apartment. First sergeant said, Sergeant Felder, you heard what happened to the president? I said, yes. He said, your leave has been canceled. You need to get out here to Fort Myer, get your team together. You got to go to Dallas to pick up the president's body.
Wow.
That's how it started for me. Well, by the time we could get uniform and transportation, President Johnson was on his way back to Washington with Kennedy's body. So we went out to Andrews Air Force Base and stood on the tarmac until Air Force One touched down. Took the body off the plane, took it to Bethesda Naval Hospital for autopsy and for embalming. For the next 4 days, the body was never out of my sight. So I witnessed the autopsy, which lasted 6 hours. I witnessed the embalming. I witnessed the changing of the casket because the casket that came up in from Dallas handle got broken on it. So we had to get a new casket. So at midnight, 3 of his top persons went out and bought a new casket at midnight to put him in. We took the body to the White House. It lied in state there for all day Saturday. On Sunday, we took it to the U.S. Capitol, to the Rotunda. It lied in state all night. It was supposed to close at 11 o'clock, but at 11 o'clock, there was still 500,000 people wanting to get through the Rotunda, so it stayed open all night. Monday, we go to take it to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the final funeral, and then to Arlington Cemetery for burial.
Emotionally, how were you able to handle all of that? I mean, not just being with the president's body for 4 days, excuse me, but just all of the other deaths and all the civil rights activists that you worked with too that had been assassinated. How did you handle that?
At that moment, it was a job. It was a job I knew we had to do flawless because we knew the world was watching us. We started off with a 6-man casket team. It was a heavy casket. The casket alone weighed almost 800 pounds. So we had to add 2 more to the details. So when you see movements of the casket, you see 8 people instead of 6. So all of those things are on your mind. You're concerned about training the other guys, the other military people, because you had all the military branches represented. We had to go out to Arlington Cemetery at night and practice taking a dummy casket up and down the steps. The steps at Arlington Cemetery is similar to the steps at the U.S. Capitol. Wow. So we needed to practice taking a casket up and down. We were out there at 2 o'clock in the morning just practicing. Everything went flawless. So it didn't hit me what had happened until after we buried him and I went home. I'm sitting in my living room. And I realized what I had done. I had buried the President of the United States, John Kennedy, a man I admired, the man I'd first ever voted for as a president. So I broke down at that point.
We're going to take another quick break. When we return, we're going to talk about Mr. Felder 60 years later going to the March on Washington in 2023, that experience and what you think has changed and what you think still needs to change. Okay. We'll be right back.